You know, the very first story we ever covered on this podcast was about the Fukushima nuclear disaster and all the bogus fear-mongering that occurred in its wake, and we continued talking about it for months, and now, 7 years later, we're still talking about it. And it's really amazing to me how an earthquake and tsunami can kill 15,000 people, but none of that seems to get mentioned because everyone's losing their minds over the nuclear power disaster, the fallout from which still cannot be attributed to a single death. But once again, like we've seen before, we see someone telling the truth about the disaster becoming a pariah. Sunichi Yamashita grew up in Nagasaki and began his research looking at the health of the survivors of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. He also visited Ukraine more than 100 times to research the Chernobyl incident. According to Yamashita, at Chernobyl you had 28 immediate deaths from rescue workers and about 50 cases of untreated thyroid cancers, but other than that, the death toll from radiation has been pretty minimal. So when this happened in his home country of Japan in March 2011, he immediately began advising local authorities about radiation, and he helped set up a health survey of the 150,000 people who were evacuated after the accident. 2 years later, he'd been completely drummed out because his findings didn't fit their narrative. The problem, he pointed out, wasn't the radiation, but the fear of radiation. Since the government stupidly didn't give out any information about radiation levels after Fukushima, people's imaginations ran wild, and you had nurses deserting their patients, doctors refused to come in from outside to help, even the Red Cross turned tail and ran. They abandoned the hospitals and evac centers where thousands of people were gathering. Supplies couldn't even come in because no one wanted to drive into the danger zone. But as it turns out, and as we covered, the radiation danger was very minimal. Less than 1% got a dose of more than 1 millisievert, and for comparison, a spinal X-ray is 2 millisieverts. An airline flight from New York to Tokyo will get you 9 millisieverts, and the lowest dose from which any form of cancer has been shown to result is 100 millisieverts. And Chernobyl residents got 350 millisieverts, and that's what caused the thyroid cancers I mentioned. And what happens is, you get this radioactive isotope of iodine, iodine-131. That gets into the thyroid because that's what the thyroid does, is it uses iodine, and that causes thyroid cancer. But if you take potassium iodide pills right after the disaster, what it does is it floods the thyroid with stable iodine, and so it doesn't take in much of the radioactive iodine, and you can prevent or at least reduce the risk of cancer. Iodine-131 levels released from Fukushima was tiny, and most of that went out to sea, and it wasn't a danger to humans. The half-life of iodine-131 is just a tiny bit over 8 days, so basically it's gone in a month. And also authorities quickly removed any foodstuffs that might have been contaminated, and they also issued KI tablets. So, everything should have been fine, but something happened to kick the panic into high gear as if it needed anything else. 2 years after the accident, long before any cases of thyroid cancer from radiation would show up, they did an ultrasound survey, and they found 113 cases of thyroid cancer, when in the same population, they should have expected to find only 4. Now, that sounds terrible, right? Except they would have expected to find 4 in a population that isn't being screened. And the reason they did this survey was so they could understand what that figure should be in a healthy population that is being screened. But that's not how the news media interpret it. I mean, if you're going to screen everyone, of course you're going to find a lot more cases. But the news media ran with a scare. One local politician, Baba Isao, said, "If you say radiation doesn't cause a problem, how can we have so many cases? The government can't give an answer to that." Yes, it can, because if you screen for more cases, you find more cases. The high rates were expected because you are finding cases that wouldn't have been diagnosed otherwise. But as radiation expert Ken Nollett said, quote, "It's very difficult to convince the public about this, and when we try, we're seen as complicit in nuclear power." And something else to consider. Plenty of people around the world have experienced those same radiation levels, absent any nuclear disasters. Since there haven't been any increases in cancer among those populations, it stands to reason there shouldn't have been any at Fukushima either. In fact, Fukushima itself may have been one of the safer places to be during the tsunami because you didn't have the same risk of drowning that you did closer to the coast in many other places. So yeah, the real disaster wasn't the nuclear disaster, it was the panic. People were herded out quickly, but that means that invalids and elderly were left behind. According to pediatrician Saochi, quote, "One woman called the ambulance from within the exclusion zone because she needed regular oxygen therapy and nobody had come to give it. And between 40 and 60 elderly people died either from being left behind or from the trauma of the evacuation. And in fact, out of 1,200 elderly in care homes, those who were evacuated were 3 times more likely to have died in the next 2 years than those who were not evacuated. And according to local Dr. Claire Leppold, the evacuation resulted in 85 suicides, even more cases of depression, evacuees drink more, exercise less, and she concluded, quote, "The evacuation may have been more dangerous than the disaster for this population." And most of the evacuation zone is still abandoned, but Yamashita said that most people could have returned home after a month when the iodine-131 had decayed. The problem is, it's really difficult to get permission to build new nuclear power facilities, so you have all these old places like Fukushima. They're having to keep using and maintaining these old ones because it's so difficult to get permission to build new ones with the newer technologies.
Yeah, and that's all government regulations do. People act like they keep everyone safer. Well, no. Another problem is people don't know how to distinguish between rhetoric and proposing something and what it actually does, and literally all they do is just make things more expensive.
Well, one time I was looking at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and seeing who was on there, and one thing I couldn't see was any actual nuclear scientists. They were all either lawyers or environmental scientists, or even just environmentalists who weren't scientists.
Yeah, that figures.
I mean, in this case with Fukushima, you have people who were basically subjected to psychological torture after what was already a terrible time. And I mean, it's far worse that we keep seeing, yet again, people who point out the truth are shamed and even threatened by those who would just keep that disastrous panic continuing on.
Well, in times of universal deceit, people who speak the truth are hated.